Remember back in video 6, we talked quite a little bit about natural selection and this whole idea of survival of the fittest. And the idea is that animals are in a population have a little bit of variety to them. They always do. And that little variety then leads to the fact that there's competition. Animals usually reproduce more than the resources around them, and so there's more animals that need food or they need to escape from predators, and what the natural environment survives. And so consequently, you have this competition, and only the ones that are fittest for that particular environment will survive. So today we want to talk a little bit more about that. And the idea here is that we would like to talk a little bit about how this idea um, is true, but that it actually helps to support the whole idea of creation rather than evolution. So, what we're talking about today is this natural selection mechanism. Remember, Darwin's came up with this idea and he used that to help explain like the differences of beaks on finches in the Galapagos Islands. The beaks, the islands that had insects basically got these longer pointed beaks because they could help the finches get insects out of the bark of trees and stuff. Whereas the islands that had finches or had these big heavy duty ones came basically on islands where they had seeds or nuts. And of course, you remember what evolution says is that it says that if you build up small changes, which is what we would call microevolution, that would lead to major changes or macroevolutions over time. In other words, each little animal may have just a small change, but if you have a whole bunch of those small changes, eventually they add up to big changes and they add up to different types of critters. Remember, we talked about the peppered moth, the light colored version. In this scenario, in this environment where there was dark trees, this one wouldn't have a great chance of survival, so it wouldn't pass on its genes to its offspring. So the population would shift to dark colored. Remember, we talked about the fact that if you have light colored trees, then the dark ones would stand out and predators would eat them most. So nature would be selecting against them and for the one that blends in more with its environment. And of course, the idea is the fittest survive. Again, another example we gave was the kaibab and the Abert squirrel. The kaibab squirrel and Abert squirrel got basically divided by the Grand Canyon over a period of probably 8 or 10,000 years. And what happens is some of the genes didn't make it into this group that made it into this group. There was a variety of genes in the original group before the Grand Canyon got here, but some of them got separated. And so we call that geologic isolation. And that isolation caused certain genes to be selected against on one side and to be selected for on the other side. So the idea is that, the fittest survive. So it certainly looks like, wow, this seems like a pretty good theory in terms of evolution. We actually have a mechanism that would cause that. And so this idea is about evolutionists use two terms. They use macroevolution and microevolution. The microevolution, what they're meaning is that you have those small changes. So you might have a wolf here, and then maybe if you interbreed it, or maybe it gets isolated, and so some of the genes get selected for, and they end up in different environments. And so some of them are fitter in one case, and some are fitter than the other. And so what happens is you have these small changes that evolve, maybe color, or maybe body size, or maybe the shape of the head, or something like that. Now, that's different than macroevolution, okay? Evolutionists say that not only do you have just like this variation within a kind of animal, but that one kind of animal, if you have enough of these changes occur over a long enough period of time, one animal becomes an entirely different one. So, like, you might have an invertebrate here, but over a period of time, if you have a whole bunch of changes to that invertebrate, eventually it ends up becoming a vertebrate, like, say, a fish. And then fish might become reptiles and reptile or amphibians, and then they become reptiles. And reptiles evolve into eventually mammals, and then eventually mammals evolve into man. And so you have this change from one really specific kind of critter to a way different type of critter. And so this is what evolutionists say happened, is that these small changes occurred over these large changes. Now, creationists don't usually talk about these changes in terms of evolution. What they say is adaptation. And some scientists that believe in evolution call this adaptation as well. The key is that creationists believe that this actually happens. They just don't believe that it's evolution. They just believe it's adapting to the surroundings. And they believe that basically the creator endowed animals with a certain variety to survive certain different environments. What they don't believe is that one kind of animal turned into a completely different kind of animal. Now, why do they believe that? Well, if you really look at the science that's going on and what we can see in the laboratory, this idea of variation or adaptation has some limits to it. Here's a good example. We have sugar beets in this country. We've raised them for a long time. Way back in the 1750s, we were measuring how much sugar was in sugar beets, and people began to inbreed them and change them so they'd be sweeter. Okay. And you can see that percentage went from like about 1% over several, 100 years to about 8 or 9%. And then you'll notice that there was a pretty big increase. And what happened was people were trying to breed these and check them out, trying to make more sugar. Part of the reason, at least in part of these years, was during World War II, they had submarines, and submarines were blowing up American ships. And so a lot of American producers were trying to inbreed these sugar beets to get more sugar in them so they'd have a different supply of sugar instead of sugar cane, because we have to import all that, but beets we could raise it at home. And you can see over the years, up until I think this is up through 2000 or something like that, you can see that we've been able to increase the percentage of sugar in these beets up to about, maybe 16, 17%. But we've been doing this now. Look how many years we've been doing this, and we've been really seriously trying to increase this for the last basically 50 or 80 years. And notice it's like it's leveling off. There's a limit to how much you can get. And that's what we see in almost every critter that we do, that we inbreed. We find that there seems to be, we can increase certain characteristics, and we can increase them quite a little bit, but there seems to be a limit whereby after so long, you can't increase it anymore. So like we have cows that give greater and greater amounts of milk, but over the last 15 or 50 years, maybe 35 years or so, we haven't been able to get cows to give much more milk. We maybe get a little bit more, but not much more at all. They're giving much more milk than they used to, but not, we haven't, it's starting to level off. Chickens have bigger breasts. Chickens have bigger drumsticks, but they're starting to level off. We can't seem to get these much bigger. I remember when I was in college, we were breeding fruit flies for genetics experiments, and we went through several generations. I think a new generation is every 2 or 3 days, and so we went through several generations. And what we were trying to do is we were looking at these hairs on the the thorax of the fruit fly. And, there are usually about 15 or 20 of these hairs. And then there are some that we call hairless, but they're not really hairless. They just have less hairs. And you can get them down to about 6 or 7 or maybe 5 hairs, but then you can't seem to get them anymore. They always have hairs. There's a limit to the variety. There's a limit to how far these adapt. And notice these are still cows. These are still chickens. These are still fruit flies. We're not changing into another completely different kind of animal. We're just varying within the animal. And there's limits within what we would call kinds of animals. All of these different dogs, we can get a variety of dogs, a lot of them. And a lot of them look a lot different, but they're still dogs. They still have basically the same genetic makeup. They have a few genes that are a little different, but basically these are all still dogs. Okay. We've done this with corn. We've had hybrid corn. Maybe you want longer ears with bigger kernels. So you take some with big kernels and you take some with longer ears and you breed them over several generations. And what you can do is you can get longer ears of corn. But one of the things we notice is that whenever you have more selection, what happens is you get less viability of that organism in the wild. These hybrid ears of corn, a lot of them end up getting disease. They're much more susceptible to disease than the more general breeds of corn, where you haven't hybridized them or tried to make these specialized adaptations. Same way with dogs. Hardly any dog can exist in the wild by itself. Like, can you imagine a corgi trying to exist out in the wild by itself? I mean, what are you going to do? Get packs of corgis that attack deer? I doubt it. And the idea here is that these are animals who were selected for particular things, but in the process of making them really specific, like short legs or long legs or skinny legs or muscular legs, what happens is they're less able to survive in the wild. So if they're less able to survive in the wild, it's doubtful that they can keep changing over and over and over again until they become a different critter. So the idea here is, and this is what the Bible basically talks about, eh, there can be variation, but it's limited within kinds and doesn't move across kinds. Now, what do we mean by kind? Well, we don't know for sure what the Bible meant by that, but it says animals reproduced after their own kind. So there could be what we would call a dog kind or a wolf kind, where you have wolves and dogs and coyotes and jackals and foxes, but they're basically the same critter. They're changed, they're different. Some of them wouldn't even breed with each other anymore. But the point is, they're still this kind of animal with four legs and canine teeth, and they all have these basic same traits. So they vary, but they don't, they're not a different kind of animal. Same way with cats. You got lions and you have tigers and you have leopards, but they're all cats. Now you can see they all look a little bit different, but they're not basically too different. They basically share almost all of the same genes. And we don't see animals going from one kind of cat to a completely different kind of cat. And this is kind of what the evolution, this is what creationists believe. They believe that natural selection happens and that the fittest do survive in different types of environments, but there's limits to about how far those can move. And remember, the finches in Darwin's thing, they were still finches. They're still birds. They're not a different kind of animal. And the peppered moth, they're still peppered moths. They're still moths. They have some different colors, but they're basically the same critter. And so the idea here is, yes, nature can change things because of environmental changes and stuff, but there's limits to how far they change. So microevolution, and this is what evolutionists call it, but really creationists really call this adaptation within kinds. And it's readily observed. You can observe this in the laboratory. You can change it, and we've observed it by breeding animals, inbreeding them and stuff, hybridizing them over many hundreds of generations. But the creation model actually suggests that that's exactly what happens. That animals can adapt, and it would make sense that they would have to adapt. And the fact that we have all the different animals we do now means that adaptation can happen pretty quickly, especially if the world is only 10 or 20,000 years old. But macroevolution, in other words, animals going from one kind of animal to another kind of animal, that's not been demonstrated. Now, of course, evolutionists would say, well, that's because it takes so long that you don't see it, that you can see this microevolution happening, and eventually it will actually be macroevolution. But again, this is not an observable thing. It's not repeatable. We haven't been able to show this at all. And so creationists point to this and say, hey, the evidence that we see in the lab today will support this idea of adaptation, but it doesn't support this idea of macroevolution. So natural selection is not an adequate mechanism to show that macroevolution can take place. Okay. And so this is one of the arguments that creationists put forth to show that the evidence doesn't really support evolution as well as it just supports adaptation within kinds.